Okay, this is the activity for Chapter 4, where we're going to go through the answers for the in-class worksheet for Chapter 4. So the first part is tissue identification, and in this part we're going to examine pictures. For each picture we're going to identify the tissue and then list the features that allowed you to make a proper identification. Also indicate at least one function of the tissue type and one place in the body where you'd find that tissue. Now this is more actually to help you with lab, where you do have to identify slides of tissues, but this will also help you in lecture for reviewing various characteristics of the tissues as well as their functions and places in the body where you can find them. So number one is this picture. And I also want to point out before we get too deep in this, there are links provided in D2L to my online lab interactive videos for even more tissue practice. So if you like the way that this video walks you through how to identify these different slides, and we only have a handful of different pictures for this in-class worksheet, but if you want to see an example of every different tissue type you have to identify in lab, check out these links on D2L. All right, so this first tissue type, if you were able to figure out that it was areolar tissue, then good job. Areolar tissue is a type of loose connective tissue proper. And so the key characteristics that allowed us to know that this was areolar are first that we saw no lumen. So that tells us that this is not a lining, and that eliminates all the epithelial tissue. And that leaves us with connective, muscular, and neural tissue as possibilities. We can also see many cells scattered around, and it looks to be multiple cell types as well. We can see multiple fiber types. We can see thick collagen fibers. We can see thinner elastic fibers and branching reticular fibers. And the fibers are not packed very tightly together, so they're kind of loosely scattered, as are the cells. So these are the characteristics that allowed us to identify this tissue. The functions of areolar tissue include that it cushions organs, it provides support, and it provides defense against pathogens, specifically with the macrophages that can be found here. And you were also asked to list one location. So here are the locations. It can be found underneath epithelial linings, between muscles, and around joints, blood vessels, and nerves. So here is the second image you were asked to identify. And so if you figured out that this was stratified squamous epithelium, congratulations. And this is also a type of epithelial tissue. So how did we figure this one out? Well, first we notice that there is a lumen or a blank space in the picture. So that tells us that we are looking at a lining that is lining either the outside of the body, or this would be the inner part of a chamber or passageway. The second thing we notice is that we have multiple layers of tightly packed cells. And remember, one characteristic of epithelia is that they are tightly packed. And then we would have looked at the shape of the cells next to the lumen and seen that they appear to be thin and flat. So all of that together would have told us that this is stratified squamous epithelium. You should have listed a function. And this type of tissue provides physical protection against abrasion, pathogens, and chemical attack. And locations include the surface of your skin and also the lining of the mouth, throat, esophagus, rectum, anus, and vagina. And in lab or in lecture, if you're asked to name one location, you could say, for example, lining the throat, and that is good enough to be one location. Here's the third picture you had to identify. So if you figured out that this was pseudostratified columnar epithelium, good job. And this is also a type of epithelial tissue. So how did we figure this one out? Again, we notice that there is a lumen or a blank space. So that told us that we're looking at a lining. We also noticed that the cells had cilia, which looks like this fringe on their apical surface, which is the side that is facing the lumen. We looked and saw tall, skinny cells, and in this picture you can kind of tell because the nuclei, which are the purple circles, are also tall and skinny, and that's so that they can fit into these shaped cells. And then you would have seen that the nuclei appear to be at different levels, so it gives the appearance of multiple layers, although this is truly just a single layer of cells. But because it looks like different layers, we say that it is pseudo-stratified, which means it's not really stratified. Remember, pseudo means false. And we know that in lab, we are not asked to identify stratified columnar. So this had to have been pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium. The cilia were also a giveaway because they are only found on pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium. All right, the functions of this tissue are protection, secretion, and to move mucus with the cilia. And it can be found lining the nasal cavity, the trachea, and the bronchi, and also in portions of the male reproductive tract. Okay, here is your fourth picture. And if you guess simple columnar epithelium, good job. So this is again a type of epithelial tissue. And again, we notice that there is a lumen up here at the top, which is a blank space that tells us that we're looking at a lining. And then we would have seen the tall, skinny cells here. These are a little bit more defined than the ones on the previous slide. And there's an example of one. Then we would have noticed that the nuclei appear to all be at one level, so it makes it definitely look like it's one layer. So that makes this simple columnar epithelium. It also has a fuzzy border, and so it's too fuzzy and indistinct to be cilia, so that means that it's microvilli, and microvilli are found on simple columnar epithelia. You might have also noticed that there is underlying areolar connective tissue because, as we learned, a lot of the epithelium has connective tissue underneath, so this is areolar connective tissue. And you might also have noticed the little red blood cells. So these are in a capillary, which is the smallest type of blood vessel, that is running through the areolar connective tissue. So remember, epithelia, which is just this top layer here, is avascular, meaning it has no blood vessels. Connective tissue does have blood vessels, at least some of it, cartilage doesn't. And so epithelial cells actually have to get their nutrients by the connective tissue that is underneath them. So nutrients have to diffuse from the blood vessels in the connective tissue up to the epithelial cells. Functions of simple columnar epithelium include protection, secretion, and absorption. And this can be found lining the stomach, the intestines, both large and small, the gallbladder, uterine tubes, and the collecting ducts of the kidneys. Okay, here's picture number 5. And if you figured out that this is cardiac muscle tissue, great job. So this is a type of muscle tissue, and we can identify this because first we see that there's no lumen, so that eliminates epithelial tissues. You may see some white areas here, but this is actually just some packing material between cells. And in fact, it looks a little bit like adipose tissue because you see like these white marshmallow looks in the white area. You also should have noticed striations, which are these faint vertical lines that you can see. I highlighted some in yellow for you to see what I'm talking about when I say the striations. And that should have told you that this is some type of muscle tissue, and it should have narrowed it down to one of two types of muscle tissue. Then you can identify that there's only one nucleus per cell, and I've highlighted one of the cells here to show you. And the cells in this type of muscle tissue can be branched. So one difference between cardiac and muscle, they're both striated, is that skeletal muscle cells are long and straight, whereas cardiac muscle cells can be branched. And here's the big kicker, the presence of intercalated discs. So in this image, it's the darker white line that you can see between cells. So the blue arrow is pointing to one, here's one here, and then there's two that I highlighted by adding a yellow line. There's a faint one over here, looks like that might have been one there. So these are the darker white lines, not the little faint lines. And remember, intercalated discs are where one cardiac cell is joined to another by gap junctions. So cardiac muscle tissue functions to circulate blood and to maintain blood pressure and can only be found in one place, and that's the heart. Here's picture number 6. This is hyaline cartilage. So this is a type of supporting connective tissue. We can identify this as hyaline by, again, there's no lumen. That eliminates all the epithelial tissues. Then we notice that we can see cells in these bubble-like structures. So what all of these are is the little dark spots are the chondrocytes, which are the specialized cell in cartilage, and the bubble-like structure is the lacuna that the chondrocyte lives in. So by seeing those bubble-like structures with cells inside of them, that should have immediately keyed you in that this is a type of cartilage. So now we just need to narrow it down between the 3 types of cartilage. And if you look further, you see that there are no visible stained fibers between the lacunae. There are fibers there, but they don't stain, and so all of that will tell you that this is hyaline cartilage. The functions include providing stiff but flexible support. Oops, typo there, should be stiff. It reduces friction between bones, and you can find hyaline cartilage between the ribs and the sternum, which is the breastbone, also covering bones at joints. In the larynx, the trachea, and the bronchi, it provides support, and also in the nasal septum, which is the little piece of cartilage that divides your left and right nasal cavity. This is image number 7, and this one is dense regular connective tissue, and that is a type of connective tissue proper, specifically a type of dense connective tissue proper. So again, we didn't see a lumen, which eliminated all of the epithelial tissues. We do see a lot of very tightly packed fibers, and we see these little cells that look sandwiched or squeezed between the fibers. These are actually fibroblasts, and you can tell that they are squeezed between the fibers because they're not actually like inside the fibers. If you look carefully, you can see that they're actually between the fibers. And the fibers all run parallel to each other, so those are all characteristics of dense regular connective tissue. This tissue functions to provide firm attachment, to conduct the pull of muscles, to reduce friction between muscles, and to stabilize the position of bones. So locations between muscles and bones, these are your tendons and aponeuroses. You can find it between bones, these are your ligaments. You can find it covering skeletal muscles and in the deep fasciae. Image number 8. I want you to contrast this with the previous image because this is one that students normally mix up. This is smooth muscle tissue. So this is a type of muscle tissue. So there is no lumen. That eliminates the epithelial cells. It's a little hard to see in this one because the cells are kind of packed tightly together. But they are spindle-shaped cells, and I outlined the outside of 3 of them so you could see that. And once you do, or once you can see the individual cells, you can see that there's 1 nucleus per cell. And one way to tell this tissue apart from the one that we just saw is that when you see the dark dots and you're trying to decide are they nuclei or are they fibroblasts, notice that in this case the dark dots are inside the cells, so they're actually in the pink material rather than squished in between like we saw on the previous picture. And we also don't see any striations, so none of those little stripes, so that makes this smooth muscle tissue. This type of tissue functions to move food, urine, and reproductive tract secretions. It also controls the diameter of your respiratory passages and your blood vessels. And you can find it in the walls of blood vessels and in the walls of digestive, respiratory, urinary, and reproductive tract organs. And then for this last picture, I just wanted you to see if you could pick out 3 different types of tissue that are all in this slide. And this is also to highlight to you that when you're looking at slides in lab, there can be multiple tissue types on one slide. So ask your instructor which tissue type you're supposed to be looking at, and on practicals they usually will point an arrow to the type that you're supposed to identify. So the first thing you should notice here is that there's a lumen. So that tells me that I'm going to have at least an epithelial tissue here because epithelial tissue forms linings. And in fact, this tissue here, so it runs in this entire area here between this line that I was drawing with my mouse and the lumen. This is transitional epithelium, and I was able to identify that because it is lining the lumen. It does have a lot of very tightly packed cells that are in multiple layers, and the cells that are closest to the lumen look cuboidal, especially look at these right here. Right, so it looks cuboidal, and I know that stratified cuboidal tissue is rare, and I also know that I'm not going to be asked to identify stratified cuboidal tissue, so that tells me that this must be transitional epithelium. Now, there probably is some areolar connective tissue that's right underneath this, but it's not visible on this particular slide. But what we can see is a layer of smooth muscle tissue. So this next pinky layer here is the layer of smooth muscle tissue, and it has spindle-shaped cells, no striations, and only one nucleus per cell. And then finally, over here on the left side, I can see adipose tissue. This looks like large white marshmallow-like cells, and I can see one nucleus per circle. Like, for example, there is a nucleus there, there's a nucleus, there's a nucleus, there's a nucleus. So that tells me that these are single cells, and because they look like marshmallows, they must be adipocytes. So this is adipose tissue. This is part 2, where we will answer different tissue questions. Question number 1 says, what are some important characteristics of epithelial tissues? And there are 5 total. So you should have come up with the following answers. Cellularity. So epithelial tissue is characterized by layer or layers of cells bound tightly together with intercellular junctions. Remember, a single layer is called a simple tissue. Multiple layers is called stratified tissue, but in both cases, the cells are bound tightly together. Epithelial tissue also is characterized by its polarity, which means the cells have a distinct apical side and a distinct basolateral side. And just a quick review, the apical surface faces the lumen, which is the internal or external environment. So in the case of the skin, it's the external environment. The internal environment would be like the inside of a cavity, chamber, or vessel. The apical surface can have cilia or microvilli on it. Microvilli are usually found on tissue specializing in transport, like the cells that line the digestive tract. And cilia are found on tissue specializing in the movement of substances, for example, the respiratory tract and the movement of mucus. The lateral surfaces connect to the neighboring cells. This goes back to the idea of the cellularity of the cells bound tightly together. And the basal surface connects to either cells underneath if it is one of the top layers, or the basement membrane if it is the bottom layer. Epithelial tissue is also characterized by attachment. So remember, the epithelia are attached to a basement membrane. And again, a quick review. The basement membrane has 2 components. The basal lamina is secreted by the epithelial cells on top of the basement membrane, and the reticular lamina is secreted by the connective tissue cells that are underneath the basement membrane. Epithelial tissue is also characterized by its avascularity, meaning it does not have any blood vessels, so nutrients, gases, and waste diffuse to and from the epithelia from the underlying connective tissue. And the final characteristic is regeneration. So you lose your epithelial cells a lot, and so they are continually being replaced by stem cells. Question 2. Compare and contrast the different types of intercellular connections using the table below. So we're going to compare and contrast tight junctions, gap junctions, desmosomes, and hemidesmosomes. So what do they all have in common? They are all specialized structures used to anchor 2 cells together. All right, so let's look at some of the differences. So for location, and this is location in the actual cells, tight junctions are located closer to the apical surface, and they're just superior to the adhesion belt, which is made up of those terminal web microfilaments. Gap junctions are located on the lateral surface between cells. Desmosomes are also on the lateral surface between cells. And hemidesmosomes are on the basal surface between the cell and the underlying basement membrane. If we look at the proteins involved, tight junctions involve interlocking proteins. Gap junctions involve proteins called connexins. Desmosomes involve CAMs, which is cell adhesion molecules, and proteoglycans. And hemidesmosomes are very similar to that. Desmosomes are just located at the bottom of the cell instead of on the sides. So it has the same proteins, CAMs and proteoglycans. Special characteristics. Tight junctions prevent the passage of water in solutes between cells. Gap junctions allow cells to share ions in small molecules. Desmosomes are very strong. The cells are so attached they peel off in sheets. So think of your skin like when it peels. And hemidesmosomes are also very strong. An example location in the body. Tight junctions can be found lining the digestive tract. Gap junctions can be found in cardiac muscle cells where it allows the cells to share ions back and forth. Desmosomes can be found in your skin, and hemidesmosomes can also be found in your skin. Okay, question number 3, compare and contrast bone and cartilage using the table below. So we're going to start with the names of the specialized cells in these tissues. Cartilage has chondrocytes. Bone has osteocytes. This goes back to knowing your root words. The location of the cells within the tissue. In cartilage, the cells are found in these little pockets. They look like bubbles called lacunae. Bone cells are also in lacunae. They don't look as much like pockets, but they're still in these little chambers. Remember, the ground substance is the same as the fluid component, and cartilage has a very gel-like consistency to its ground substance, and it's made primarily of chondroitin sulfates. You'll find this a lot in vitamins and supplements that say that they help your joints. Bone has very little liquid in its ground substance, and it's mainly made up of calcified matrix that is primarily calcium phosphate. All right, if we look at the types of fibers, in cartilage you can find all 3 types. Oops, I'm missing a comma. Collagen, elastic, and reticular. And in bone, it's just going to be collagen. If we look at the vascularity or the prevalence of blood vessels, cartilage has none. It is avascular, like epithelial tissue, and bone has an extensive blood supply. Then if we look at the name of the membrane covering, and a little side question here, these are made of what tissue type? And the answer is that the coverings are made of dense irregular connective tissue. The name of the covering for cartilage is the perichondrium, and the name of the covering for bone is the periosteum. Again, root words will help you. In terms of strength, cartilage has limited strength, but it's flexible. And bone is very strong, but not flexible. And then finally, the ability for repair. Cartilage has a very limited ability for repair, and that is mainly because it is avascular, whereas bone has an extensive ability for repair. So if you break a bone, it will heal, either if set back in the normal position, or it could even heal in a funky position if you didn't get it set. Number 4, what type of tissue has a matrix? How does the matrix differ between the subtypes of this tissue? So remember that a matrix is found in connective tissue, and the matrix is a combination of all of the extracellular fibers and the ground substance, which is that fluid component. So remember, matrix equals the extracellular fibers plus fluid, and you find this in connective tissues. So in connective tissue proper, that's your loose and dense connective tissues, the ground substance is viscous, which means it has like a syrupy type of consistency. So think of like pouring honey, for example. And you find all 3 fiber types, collagen, reticular, and elastic, depending on which particular subtissue type you're looking at. Fluid connective tissue has a very watery ground substance. It's actually called plasma. And there are usually no fibers except during blood clotting. And then with supporting connective tissue, you have very little ground substance. It has a gel-like consistency in cartilage, and it is very hard calcium carbonate in, calcium phosphate in bone. And it is made up of many densely packed fibers, mostly collagen, but in cartilage you can also find some elastic and reticular fibers. Question number 5, what is the difference between loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue? Loose connective tissue has more cells and fewer fibers, which are not closely packed together, and that's what gives it the loose characteristic. And dense connective tissue has fewer cells and many more densely packed fibers, and that's where the term dense comes from. Number 6, think about tissue degeneration. Why do you lose height as you get older? So you actually get shorter as you age. If you didn't know that, you lose about 1 to 3 inches as you age. So if you remember, cartilage is a tissue that does not heal well because it is avascular and doesn't have a blood supply. So over time, you get cumulative damage to all the cartilage in your body. In particular, the intervertebral discs in your spine made of fibrocartilage, they deteriorate over time, and then you get compression of the spine, and this is going to reduce your overall height. So here is a picture on the left. This would be a normal intervertebral disc made of fibrocartilage, and then on the right shows how as you age it breaks down, it becomes more narrow, and you have these between all of your vertebrae, so the cumulative height loss over time adds up to be 1 to 3 inches. Osteoporosis and scoliosis can also play a role in why you lose height as you age. So if you put those as possible answers, those are also correct. And we will talk more about both of those in Chapter 6. So number 7, it's been said that Alzheimer's disease is a disease of old age. Explain what this means. Remember that damaged neurons, which are brain cells, cannot be repaired or replaced. Alzheimer's disease involves progressive death of your neurons due to a buildup of protein plaques. We mentioned that briefly in the Chapter 3 activity. But over time, as you get these neurons die, you can't replace them, you can't repair them. So as the neural tissue damage accumulates, your chance of having Alzheimer's disease increases. So why they call it a disease of old age is that your risk of getting Alzheimer's increases as you age. Right? So the older you are, the more likely you are to have Alzheimer's. And this final part is about organizing the material. So often when studying large amounts of material, it helps to organize it. The act of creating tables or charts can help you to effectively review and memorize material. And these types of charts can sometimes show up on exams, or at least the types of information that are in these charts usually do show up on exams. So for this particular chart that I provided you in the worksheet, you're going to get the most out of it if you try to fill out the chart on your own and then come back to this video to check your answers. If you just listen to this video and write down all the answers without looking up anything on your own, it's not really going to help you. So part of the learning process is hunting and searching for the answers yourselves. But I'm going to go through the answers here, and I'm going to do it pretty quickly. This is just for you to check the answers that you looked up on your own, so you can pause the video wherever you need to check your answers. All right, so we're going to go through these different tissue types and give a general class of tissue, a description, a function, and an example in the body. So simple squamous is epithelial tissue. These are thin, flat cells in a single layer. They reduce friction, control permeability. They also participate in absorption and secretion. You can find these in the mesothelia, that is your pericardium, your pleura, and your peritoneum. You can find it in the endothelia, which is the lining of blood vessels, some of the ducts in the kidney, the cornea, and the alveoli, which is in your lungs. Stratified squamous is also epithelial tissue. These are thin, flat cells that are on the outermost layer of a many-layered lining. They provide physical protection against abrasion, pathogens, and chemicals. And you can find this type of tissue in your skin, lining of your mouth, your throat, your esophagus, your rectum, your anus, and your vagina. Simple cuboidal is also epithelial tissue. These are square or box-shaped cells in a single layer. They provide limited protection, but are really good at absorption and secretion. And you can find this type of tissue in glands, ducts, part of the ducts of the kidney, and the thyroid gland. Stratified cuboidal is also epithelial tissue. In this type of tissue, you've got many layers, and the cells at the outermost layer look square or cube-shaped. It functions in protection, secretion, and absorption, and you can find this lining some ducts, and it's a pretty rare tissue. Transitional is also an epithelial tissue. Transitional tissue looks multi-layered. It appears cuboidal when relaxed and squamous when stretched. It allows expansion and recoil after stretching, and you can find it in the urinary system, namely the bladder, the renal pelvis, and your ureters. Simple columnar tissue is also epithelial tissue. You have tall, skinny cells in a single layer. This type of tissue can have microvilli, and the nuclei all appear to be at the same level when looking at pictures. It functions to protect, secrete, and absorb, and you can find this lining your stomach, intestines, gallbladder, uterine tubes, and some of the ducts in the kidney. Then you have pseudostratified columnar, which is also epithelial. This appears like stratified columns, which means multiple layers, but it's actually only one layer. It usually has cilia, which is a dead giveaway for identifying this type of tissue. And when you're looking at it, what makes it look like a stratified tissue is the nuclei are at all different levels. This type of tissue functions in protection, secretion, and the movement of mucus around with the cilia. And you can find it lining the nasal cavity, the trachea, the bronchi, and parts of the male reproductive tract. Stratified columnar is also epithelial tissue. In this case, you see many layers, and the cells on the outermost layer are tall, skinny, column-like cells. It provides protection, and this is another rare tissue, but you can find it in small areas of the pharynx, epiglottis, anus, mammary glands, salivary glands, and the urethra. Areolar tissue is connective tissue, and specifically it's a type of loose connective tissue. With this type of tissue, it's the least specialized, so you can see many different cell types and fiber types. It functions to cushion, provide support, and also defense. You can find areolar tissue under epithelial linings, between muscles, and around joints, blood vessels, and nerves. Adipose tissue is also a loose connective tissue. You can see many adipocytes, which look a bit like marshmallows on the slide images. It functions as padding, it cushions shocks, it insulates, and it helps you store energy. Examples in the body include deep under the skin in the area called the hypodermis. So hypo means below, so this is below the dermis of the skin, and padding around organs. Reticular tissue is also a type of loose connective tissue. It is a network of branching reticular fibers with lots of similar type cells surrounding them. So it functions to provide a supporting framework, which is called a stroma, for all of those cells, which are called the parenchyma. You can find reticular tissue in the liver, kidney, spleen, lymph nodes, and bone marrow. And dense regular is a type of dense connective tissue. And with dense regular, you're going to see parallel collagen fibers with fibroblasts squeezed between them. This functions as a point of firm attachment. It also conducts the pull of muscles, reduces friction, and stabilizes bone position. And you can find dense regular tissue in tendons, aponeuroses, ligaments, and the skeletal muscle covering, so the membrane that wraps around skeletal muscles. Elastic tissue is a type of dense connective tissue. It's actually a subtype of dense regular. It is formed from parallel elastic fibers with fibroblasts in between. It functions to stabilize the vertebrae in the penis. It cushions shocks, and it permits the expansion and contraction of organs. So you can find this in some spinal ligaments, some ligaments of the penis, and inside blood vessel walls. Dense irregular is also a dense connective tissue. This appears to be a meshwork of collagen fibers, meaning there's no regular structure. They're just branching in all sorts of directions. It functions to provide strength to withstand forces from many directions and also to prevent overexpansion. You can find dense irregular tissue in organ capsules, the periosteum, the perichondrium, and nerve and muscle sheaths. and in the deep layer of the skin called the dermis. Blood is a type of fluid connective tissue. It is a watery matrix with a lot of formed elements. So you've got a lot of red blood cells, but you also can find some white blood cells and some platelets. It functions to carry cells and dissolve materials like nutrients, gases, and waste. And you can find this type of tissue inside blood vessels and inside the heart. Lymph is also a fluid connective tissue. It's also a watery matrix, but it has fewer elements. So you will see some lymphocytes, which are white blood cells, but you will see very few red blood cells, and you may see some platelets. Lymph functions to equalize the levels of nutrients, waste, and toxins. It also helps maintain blood volume, and it allows immune surveillance of the blood. And you can find lymph inside lymphatic vessels. Hyaline cartilage is also connective tissue, but this is supporting connective tissue. The description is chondrocytes and lacunae, and you don't see any visible stained fibers between the lacunae. It functions to provide stiff but flexible support, and it also reduces the friction between bony surfaces. You can find hyaline cartilage between the ribs and the sternum, also in the larynx, trachea, bronchi, the nasal septum, which separates your left and right nostril, and covering the ends of bones at synovial joints, which are joints that can move. Elastic cartilage is also supporting connective tissue. You'll still see the chondrocytes in the lacunae, but now you will see abundant elastic fibers between the lacunae. Elastic cartilage provides support, but tolerates distortion, which means you can move it and squish it and bend it, but it returns to original shape. You can find this in the auricle of the ear, which is your flap of your ear, the epiglottis, larynx, and the auditory canal. And then fibrocartilage is also supporting connective tissue. It also has chondrocytes and lacunae, but you have visible collagen fibers running parallel between the lacunae. It functions to resist compression. It also prevents bone-to-bone contact and limits movement. You can find fibrocartilage in the pads in your knee joint called the menisci, between your two pubic bones, and in your intervertebral discs. Bone is also supporting connective tissue. With bone, the compact form, so there's two types of bone. You'll go over the other type in lab. The compact form has osteons, and bone is composed of a mineralized matrix of collagen fibers and calcium phosphate salts. It functions as for support, protection, a place to store minerals, namely calcium. It's also where your blood cells are produced in the bone marrow, and it provides leverage for when you need to exert force by using your muscles. To provide an example of a bone, you can give me any of the 206 bones you have in your body. We'll go over all of these later in the semester. Some examples: the femur, the humerus, and the sternum, just to name three. Skeletal muscle is a type of muscle tissue. It has striations, which are repeating units of actin and myosin that you can see under the microscope. It has many nuclei per cell and long unbranching cells. Skeletal muscle functions to move and stabilize the skeleton. It guards entrances and exits. It generates heat, and it protects internal organs. Again, when providing an example in the body, you can name any of your approximately 715 muscles. Two big examples: your biceps brachii in your arm and your gluteus maximus in your butt. Cardiac muscle is also muscle tissue. It also has striations. These tend to be single nucleus. The cells can branch, and the dead giveaway feature for these is they have intercalated discs. Cardiac muscle functions to circulate blood and to maintain blood pressure, and is only found in the heart. Smooth muscle is also muscle tissue. It has no striations. The cells have a single nucleus, and the cells are spindle-shaped. Smooth muscle functions to move food, urine, and reproductive secretions, and it also controls the diameter of your respiratory passages and your blood vessels. So an example in the body, you can find them in the walls of the blood vessels and in the walls of organs in your digestive, respiratory, urinary, and reproductive tracts. Now, the last type of tissue is actually neural tissue, but I broke it down into neuron and neuroglia as two components so we could talk about them separately. So again, this is part of the neural tissue, but we're going to specifically talk about neurons. A description, for now, you need to know they have three parts: the dendrites, the cell body, and the axon. They function to conduct electrical signals, and you can find them in your brain, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves. And then the neuroglia are the other component of neural tissue. As far as a description, there are varied types, and they look different depending on what type. But in general, they are smaller than neurons and more numerous than neurons. You have about 10 neuroglia for every one neuron. They have a variety of functions. They maintain the structure of the neural tissue. They repair neural tissue after injury. They do phagocytosis. They provide nutrients to the neurons, and they regulate the fluid around the neurons. In the brain and spinal cord, you can find ependymal cells, astrocytes, oligodendrocytes, and microglia. And in your peripheral nerves, you can find satellite cells and Schwann cells. And that is it. That is the entire chart. And again, hopefully you looked up all that information on your own and only use this video to check your answers. And that is it for Chapter 4.